Hello. I'm here tonight to share 3 stories with you. 3 short stories that I hope will motivate and inspire you to consider reinventing yourself, because amazing things can happen in our lives when we reinvent ourselves. The first story is about leadership. The second story is about unrealized or untapped potential. The third story, well, that really depends. It could be about leadership, it could be about untapped potential, or it could be about both, because the third story is about you and your story. The first story about leadership features an Air Force officer, but not just any old Air Force officer. I'm talking about an exceptional, remarkable Air Force officer. And so many years ago, when this officer entered the Air Force, along with the 4,000 to 5,000 other lieutenants that enter the Air Force, time and time again, he stood head and shoulders above his most competent, capable peers. Time and time again, he earned promotion after promotion after promotion, ultimately achieving the rank of 4-star general, the highest rank you can achieve in the military. Now, to put that into perspective, less than 1% of all officers who enter the military, less than 1% ever earn the rank of 4-star general. He was the best of the best of the best and the brightest of the bright. Throughout his distinguished career, he established himself as a skilled fighter pilot, as a team builder, as a consensus builder, as a strategic thinker and a strategic planner, and a complex problem solver. As his career culminated, he was a 4-star general in command of all the Air Force units across Europe, where he routinely met with senior political and military leaders across NATO and Europe to help shape defense policy and defense strategy. In light of today's events, we can see how immensely important this job was and this command was. Well, if you can imagine, towards the end of his career, there was a lot of competition out there as he was going to retire to bring him on to their organization or their organization. Who wouldn't want a remarkable leader like that as part of their leadership team? Well, as fate would have it, he ended up as the president of a large state public university in the South. Now, you might imagine, and it's reasonable and it's logical to imagine, that based on his proven track record of immense success, that he would have had similar success as a university president. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's not what happened. In fact, after less than 2 years of limited success and subpar performance, he decided to step down as the university president. Now this story, and I'm a scholar of leadership, this story puzzles me, and maybe it puzzles you too. Because if we believe that leadership is universal and leadership skills are easily transferable from one organization or one career field to another, why do we sometimes see remarkable leaders who flourish in one organization stumble in another? Are we to believe that this remarkable Air Force general mysteriously forgot how to lead? No, ladies and gentlemen, that's not what happened. In fact, the story about the Air Force general has less to do with leadership than it has to do with this thing called role identity. And when this Air Force general, who served for over 30 years, and in a very short time became a university president, he was serving as a university president under his old role identity as an Air Force general, and it created a disconnect. In other words, he did not reinvent himself. He did not recreate himself in his new role. So now that I've introduced this topic or this concept about role identity, you might be wondering, all right, Darrin, what is this thing called role identity? Why is it so important as it relates to leadership? And why is role identity so important as it relates to us achieving our full potential in life? Well, I'm glad you asked. Role identity is a term used to describe who we are. It's how we describe ourselves to others. It's how we think about who we are. Role identity is formed by many factors, and it's not just our work lives. It's our personal background, it's our physical appearance, it's the groups we affiliate with, and it's all the life's experience that shape us along the way. All these things combine to form our own role identity. And everybody has their own role identity. If I were to ask you to describe yourself to me in just a few words, your response would tell me a lot about your role identity. I might hear things such as, I'm an executive director, I'm a mom, I'm Jamaican, I'm a Braves fan, or I'm a military veteran. Notice how those answers spanned across our professional and non-professional or non-work lives. Well, when we go back to the story about the Air Force general, his role identity was still very much as an Air Force general. And when we shift to a new role, especially when it's a major shift going from the military to higher ed, we have to reinvent ourselves if we're going to have the same success that we had before. Well, I hope you liked the first story, and if you did, I think you're going to like the second story a little bit more, because the second story is about me. So now that I know a little bit about role identity, it's so clear for me to see, hindsight is 20/20. When I look back over my life, it's so clear to see that when I hit rock bottom, when I hit stumbling blocks in my life, it was because of my role identity. My role identity was being shaped going all the way back to my early childhood, where I grew up in public housing with my siblings in a single-parent house. Public housing, AKA the projects. Life in the projects can be rough, and life in the projects is a much different experience than growing up in suburban America. Now, if you've never been to the projects or you never lived in the projects, walk with me for just a minute. I'm going to take you on the windshield tour of the projects. If you grew up in the projects, it was very likely that you grew up in a single-parent household. And it's very likely that that single parent was your mom, because dads were either not involved in their kids' lives, or if they were, it was just barely involved in their kids' lives. If you grew up in the projects, you grew up at or below the poverty line. If you grew up in the projects, it was unlikely that you had any immediate family members who were college graduates, and you yourself would be unlikely to go to college and graduate. If you grew up in the projects, you were exposed to higher rates of crime, violence, and drugs. Ladies and gentlemen, that was my experience growing up in the projects. So as a young boy, to prevent myself from falling into some of the pitfalls that a lot of young boys fall into in the projects, I decided to put all my time and energy into playing sports. I spent countless hours at the local Boys and Girls Club playing sports, playing games. If you name it, I played it. My mom, my amazing mom, got me involved in every youth sports league you can imagine. Basketball, baseball, football. Not only did I play, I was getting pretty good. And it seemed that the better that I got in sports, the less I cared about school. School was for fools. School is for idiots. I'm a basketball player. So I assumed the role identity of dumb jock. So most of my K through 12 education, I held myself down by adopting this role identity of a dumb jock. And so school wasn't cool to me, but I knew, because ladies and gentlemen, I had hoop dreams. I knew I was going to the NBA. And sometimes I wish somebody would have pulled me to the side and said, hey, Darrin, guess what? You're only 6'3", and you don't have a very high vertical, and you're not the fastest guy in the world. But nobody did that. So I continued down this path with the role identity of a dumb jock. And I was in for a rude awakening when I got to my first college, because I was just there to play basketball. But the role identity of dumb jock wouldn't get me to the finish line. In fact, I failed out, and not once, but twice. Failing out of college twice was a rock bottom experience for me. And I started to really think about who I am. And I knew I had more to give. I knew I was more than just a dumb jock, but for years and years, that was my role identity. So I joined the Army, and the Army became a transformational experience to me. For the first time in my life, I realized that I could be more than just a dumb jock. So I adopted a new role identity, the role identity of a motivated soldier. I remember getting to my unit in Germany, and I remember enrolling in classes at the University of Maryland on the post where I was stationed. And I exchanged a dumb jock's F's for a soldier's A's. I remember my leadership recognizing my potential and encouraging me to apply for an ROTC scholarship so I could become an officer and lead soldiers. Well, I'm grateful to share with you tonight that I went on to get that ROTC scholarship. I went back to college, and then this time, instead of failing out, I graduated with honors. I graduated as a distinguished military graduate, and I earned a commission as a second lieutenant, where I went on to serve for 18 more years to include 3 deployments to Iraq. That was my story. And if you like the second story, I think you're gonna like the third story the best, because the third story is about you. The third story is your story. Now, I don't know your story, or your story, or your story, but I do know this. Every one of us has a story. We all have a story to tell. And in life, we're all on a different path. Sometimes we're on the path that we feel we should be on. Sometimes we're not on the path we feel like we should be on. Regardless of what path you're on, if you think about your role identity and you reinvent yourself and recreate yourself, you're going to open new opportunities for yourself. Nature gives us some fascinating metaphors to describe our own lives. Consider, if you will, the caterpillar. Alone, a caterpillar has a lot of limitations, but it doesn't stay a caterpillar forever. In fact, something miraculous happens. It goes through a transformation. It goes through a metamorphosis. And one day, that caterpillar breaks free from its cocoon. And now, instead of seeing a caterpillar, we see a brightly colored, beautiful butterfly that at some point will spread its wings and fly. Well, that metaphor is my metaphor. All those years that I assumed the role identity of a dumb jock, that was me being a caterpillar. That was me limiting myself. And when I joined the Army and I changed my role identity and I reinvented who I was, it became my butterfly experience. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that my metaphor of the caterpillar and the butterfly can become your metaphor too. Because I am absolutely convinced that if we are bold enough and brave enough, courageous enough, and even vulnerable enough to reinvent who we are and to recreate ourselves, there's absolutely no limit to the things we can accomplish. Thank you.